And at 8 o'clock this morning, my husband came into the bedroom and said, "Don't you have a meeting at 9 o'clock down at the construction site?" I said, "What time is it?" And he said, "It's not, it's 8 o'clock. I said, "Holy fright." So that's how my day started. It was hit the ground running, but I'm really happy to be here today and to talk a little bit about the suffrage movement, some suffragists that you may have not heard of, and a little bit about the memorial that we are building to commemorate and honor them. Next slide. I call this presentation the best kept secret in American history, and sometimes America's original Wonder Women. And the reason for that is because, as of one of our historians likes to say, most people don't know about the suffrage movement because the white men who wrote the history books didn't think it was important and they left it out. And in fact, when I do presentations all over the country to all ages, whether they are middle school, high school, a League of Women Voter Organizations, Greater Federation of Women Clubs organizations, and so forth, that has been the case, that people really don't know a whole lot about the movement. And so I'm hoping today to share some information that you'll find interesting and you'll learn a little bit. Next slide, please. The first two women that I would like to introduce you to are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. These women were abolitionists in the first part of the 19th century. And they met in 1840 when they both went to England to participate in an anti-slavery convention. Now, if you will, think about the era, and these women were on a ship and they went all the way across the ocean to participate as official delegates of the United States at this convention. Well, imagine their surprise when they got there, when they were told that you can't participate in this convention because you're women. And not only that, but you can't even be in the same room as the convention and the discussion. And we'll put up a sheet so you can sit behind that and you can listen in, but you dare not say anything or you will be removed from the organization's meeting. I don't know how that would have made you feel, but I think I can speak for them, not ever having met them, that they were not happy campers. And they came back to the United States. And next slide, please. In 1848, these two women convened the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. This was something that they had planned. It was a 2-day convention. If you can imagine, it was upstate New York. It was July, it was hot. Men and women attended. There were about 300 attendees that were there. And at the conclusion of the 2-day meeting, they were able to produce a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it was based on the Declaration of Independence because these women were looking to have rights that women did not have at that time. They were considered property of their husband. They weren't able to get a formal education because colleges didn't allow women in. If they got divorced, they didn't get their children. If they worked, their husband took their paycheck. At the time, there was also a big temperance group going on in the United States because men were drinking and they would get drunk and they would beat women. And so there was a big movement to end that. But if a husband really didn't like you, he could actually have you committed to an insane asylum and they threw away the key and there wasn't anything you can do about it. So as you can imagine, this was why these women wanted to convene this convention. There was a discussion beforehand that one of the platforms should be enfranchisement for women. And it was a controversial one, but it was put in. And at the conclusion of the 2-day meeting, every line item that they wanted to focus on was unanimously approved by the body that was in attendance with the exception of enfranchisement, getting the vote. That was something that was really radical thinking. It was like, oh my gosh, you know, the idea of allowing women to vote was just unbelievable. And Frederick Douglass attended this meeting. He was the only African-American person there, but he was the one that really, really emphasized that they should do this. And the majority of the people voted in favor of it. So we look at the suffrage movement as having begun in 1848 because it was reduced to a document that lived beyond this convention. So but that's why we look at that as being the beginning of the suffrage movement. Next slide, please. When we talk about the suffrage movement, this is the first person that comes to mind. There isn't anybody, I think, that has not ever heard of Susan B. Anthony. They don't necessarily know a whole lot about her. They know that she was supporting the vote for women, but they don't know a whole lot more than that. And one of the reasons that her name has become associated with suffrage is because the 19th Amendment was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, so it was named after her. She met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, and the two women joined forces, and they began to work together for suffrage. And so what happened was they began a suffrage organization, and there were some other women in other parts of the country that had started some suffrage organizations, and they were banding together trying to move forward on this. And so throughout the next 50 years in our country, there were suffrage associations that were unique. Some of them disbanded, some of them merged together. And so it was kind of interesting. Susan was a member of the DAR. She dedicated her entire life to suffrage, and guess what she did in 1872? She walked into a polling place in New York, and she voted for the President of the United States. She was immediately arrested. She was hauled off to court. She was found guilty. She was fined $100, which I don't even know what that would be in today's money, but a lot of money. And the judge asked her if she had anything to say. That was his first mistake. Boy, did she have a lot to say. So she started talking about, you know, the injustice of women not being able to vote, not being counted as a citizen under the Constitution and so forth. And so he couldn't wait to get her out of there. She never paid the fine, and she never went to jail. You may have heard that earlier in August, President Trump absolved her of that being arrested for that and that blemish on her record, although people from the Susan B. Anthony house said that she probably wouldn't have wanted that, but nonetheless, she no longer has that blemish on her lifelong record. Next slide, please. I'd next like to introduce you to one of my favorite suffragists. Her name is Ida B. Wells. Ida was from Mississippi. Her parents were slaves. It was a very large family. Over time, she became a journalist, a publisher, a teacher, and an activist. She moved from Mississippi to Kentucky, where she had a printing press, and she would print things a great deal about the lynchings that were taking place in America. And they came in, and vigilantes came in and destroyed her printing press, threatened her life. She then moved to New York, and then she eventually moved to Chicago, which is where she settled. She became a big community leader in Chicago, and her offspring still live there. Michelle Duster is her great-granddaughter, and Michelle is on our Turning Point Honorary Board. So we've had a great relationship with her. We've learned a lot about Ida B. Wells. One of the things that I really like about Ida is that she just, despite the many charges against her life. I mean, she was always being harassed. She was always being threatened. She didn't stop. I mean, she just felt that what she needed to do was for the greater good. When she was in Chicago, she met her husband, Mr. Barnett. So she's really Ida B. Wells Barnett. And the two of them continued their fight for equality for Black people. One of the things that she was a founder of the NAACP, but she also founded organizations in Chicago as well. And she's one of my favorites because she just never, ever gave up. The next person I would like to introduce you to on the next slide is Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Chapman Catt became the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And at the turn of the century and going into the 20th century, NASA, as the acronym is how we refer to it, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, that organization had a strategy that was different from another organization that we're going to talk about. And their strategy was for women to get the vote state by state. Now, one of the great things that happened, well, it wasn't great, but Carrie came into a huge amount of money when a follower of hers, who she had only ever met one time briefly, passed away and bequeathed her $2 million. And so she had money to be able to go out into all of the states and set up offices that were part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, to try to influence state legislatures to allow women to vote. And this organization was quite successful in being able to do that. They were successful west of the Mississippi. There were a number of states in the West that eventually allowed women to vote. And that was really good because at the end of the day, if we wanted Congress to approve an amendment, we needed to have people in Congress that these women had elected that would go to Congress and eventually vote in favor of an amendment. At the end of the era of suffrage movement, which was in 1920, what Carrie did was she turned every one of her offices in each state into the League of Women Voters. She was the founder of the League of Women Voters, which of course is still alive and well and very, very active today. It is a nonpartisan organization, just like our organization is a nonpartisan organization. But she was the one that did that. The next person I would like to introduce you to is Alice Paul. Alice was a Quaker. She lived in New Jersey. The Quakers were very progressive in that they treated their women equally. They were all about women getting educated. They treated their women folk in an equal way. And Alice did get to go to college, and she went to Europe to complete her education, which was what affluent women did in the day. And she went to Germany, and then she eventually wound up in England, where she met the Pankhurst sisters, who were fighting for suffrage in England. Now, one of the things that comes up from time to time is the word suffragist and the word suffragette. And in England, the women that were involved in the movement were called suffragettes, which was actually a pejorative term, in that they were involved in violent acts. They would break windows, they set fires, they put bombs in mailboxes. That was extremely radical at the time. They were considered militant because of those things. And so Alice, as a Quaker, didn't get involved in any of that, but she sure was paying attention to it. She did get involved in some of the parades and things that they did. She was arrested. She was jailed. She was force-fed when she was jailed and went on a hunger strike. So she learned a whole lot about how one could strategize to achieve suffrage. She was really a very brilliant strategist. At the end of her life, she had earned over 6 college degrees, because if she didn't know something, she'd go back to college and become an expert in it. She had 2 different law degrees at the end of her life. She was she was really an amazing woman. She lived in Washington, D.C. In the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Memorial. That's what it's called right now. that was their headquarters. That was their final headquarters. They had a couple of different places during the suffrage movement, but that was the final one. And it is still there today, and it is run by the National Park Service. So when you come to Washington, it's something that you can visit. It's on the hill. It's right next to the Hart Senate office building. In fact, there were some that wanted to tear down this mansion, and so they could build the Hart office building, Senate office building, even bigger. But Barbara Mikulski, Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, I believe she would have laid down in front of those trucks that were going to destroy this house, because she did everything she could to save it, and it should have been saved. So it's there today for us to enjoy. After the 19th Amendment was passed, Alice Paul was the author of the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was introduced into Congress every single year and finally passed in 1972. And then, as we know, Congress passes these amendments, but then they have to be ratified, and Virginia was the last 38th state to ratify, but it's being held up with a lot of technical, controversial things in Congress, but she is the one that was the author for that. The next person I would like to introduce you to is Adelina Otero-Warren. She was a Hispanic suffragist in New Mexico. And the reason that I'm putting these people in there is because I want you to understand that it wasn't just upper class white women that were involved in the movement. There were many others who were as well. She was leader of the Congressional Union, which was part of NASA in the beginning, and then she switched over and was part of the National Women's Party. That was the one that Alice Paul began. And she was decided to run for the House of Representatives in 1922. Well, when she was young, Adelina got married, and it wasn't a great marriage. And so they were only married for 2 years, and they got divorced. Well, as she was campaigning, it came out during the campaign that she was a divorcee. And boy, I'll tell you, that was the end of her political career. There was nobody in their right mind that was ever going to vote for a woman who was a divorcee, and that was the end of her political career. But she blossomed and continued to be very strong in education, as she was in New Mexico. She was revered, and she was beloved by everybody in her state, and did a marvelous job. The next person I would like to introduce you to, pardon me, is Rose Winslow. Rose was a Polish Jewish immigrant who was in, excuse me, who settled in New York, and she became involved in the suffrage movement. There was a big movement in New York. There was a big movement in Boston going on. There were just a lot of centers of activity where there were women banding together to fight for suffrage. She was a union organizer, and in 1917, we're going to talk about this a little more, the National Women's Party began picketing the White House, and she was one of the ones that came down from New York, and she joined them, and she was among those that were picketing. And she was among those that were arrested, and she was jailed in the Occoquan Workhouse. She was one of the ones that here went on a hunger strike. She was force-fed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I want you to see that there were women coming together of all ilks to fight for suffrage. Next, I would like to introduce you to the Delta Sigma Theta sorority that was founded in 1913. In 1913, Alice Paul decided to organize the first women's rights parade in Washington, D.C. There had been one, I believe, in New York, but there had never been one in Washington, D.C. And as I mentioned to you, she was a brilliant strategist. And so she decided to have this parade on the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. It was March 3rd, 1913. At Howard University, a historic African-American college, there was a sorority called the Alpha Kappa Alphas. They are still alive and well and thriving throughout the United States. And there were some women that belonged to that sorority who wanted to march in the parade. But the Alpha Kappa Alphas, I've been able to get my hands on some correspondence between the president of the Alpha Kappa Alphas and Alice Paul. And the Alphas wanted to be ensured that they weren't going to be expected to march at the back of the parade. And excuse me, Alice Paul couldn't guarantee that. So the Alphas said, we're not marching. Well, there were 22 women that belonged to the Alphas who said, well, we want to march. And so they founded in February of 1913, the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, which is also now a huge international sorority. And these 22 women that you see in the picture were properly escorted by men, and they did participate in the parade. And they have been big supporters of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial, and they have been great supporters of ours. So next, you're going to see a picture of this parade in 1913. It doesn't look like much of a parade, and that's because, as I said to you, this was Alice decided to schedule this the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So Woodrow Wilson comes into Union Station on the train from New Jersey, and he looks around, there's nobody there. And he was expecting, crowds to be welcoming him, but there weren't any. So he said, where is everybody? And they said, well, they're over on Pennsylvania Avenue. There's a big parade going on. Well, if you look at this picture, you can see a lot of bowler hats, which were worn by men in the day. And what do you suppose these men were doing all day while they were waiting? There were many speakeasies and bars and so forth. And so many of these men were well on their way to feeling no pain. They started, for those of you who have been to Washington and you've ever seen Pennsylvania Avenue, it is a very wide boulevard. And so the women, they could march 12 abreast. And these men became more and more rowdy. They began encroaching on the women who were marching. They began throwing things at them, spitting on them, knocking them down. It became pretty horrific. The DC police stood down. They would not help. Alice had already met with them and asked them to, be vigilant in case there were going to be any problems, and they just wouldn't do anything. This parade, which included around 6,000 to 7,000 marchers from every state, and also from a number of countries around the world that also allowed women to vote in those countries. They also came. So it was big. I mean, there's a lot of pageantry, and the women were in beautiful costumes. The nurses marched together. The teachers marched together. I mean, it was just an amazing event. Well, the crowd encroached, and so the women were literally at the end marching single file. Alice had the appropriate people call in the cavalry from Fort Myer across the Potomac River. And the cavalry had to come in to push these men back so the parade could be finalized. Over 200 women were taken to the hospital because they had been abused. So this was in 1913, but this was what women were willing to endure for you and me to have the vote. The next person I would like to introduce you to is Inez Milholland Boissevain. She was considered to be one of the most beautiful suffragists. She was a lawyer from New York. She dealt with civil rights for women. She represented women that were in unions. She and her father were both members of the NAACP once it was formed. She became very active in Alice Paul's National Women's Party. She was considered a brilliant orator, and in fact, when she was sent out in the field to do speeches around the country to try to encourage women to get their legislators to allow them to vote state by state, You know, she was one of the ones that would draw crowds all over. And in November of 1916, she was in Los Angeles and she was giving a speech and she collapsed at the podium. She was taken to the hospital, and a couple of weeks later, at the age of 30, she died of pernicious anemia. And she was considered, became known, you know, as a martyr in the movement. Alice Paul's organization, the women were devastated. They were absolutely devastated to have lost one of their foremost leaders, who essentially gave her life for the movement. So Alice and then we heard about Ruth Bader Ginsburg being the first woman to lie in state in Statuary Hall in the Capitol. But on Christmas Day of 1916, there was a huge ceremony for Inez, Milholland, Boissevain in Statuary Hall. And I'm going to assume that her body wasn't there because I didn't hear about the fact that they had this big, there were thousands of people that came to honor her because of her passing and everything that she had done. But that was the first time that there certainly was a woman that was honored in Statuary Hall, but I will have to assume that her body did not lay in state there, but they did have a big ceremony for her. So the very first woman was actually a suffragist that was honored in the Capitol. So Alice got several of her members together, and they asked for a meeting with the president. And back in those days, it was pretty easy to get a meeting with the president. Chapman, Catt, who was the head of the other organization, met with him on a regular basis, you know, trying to get him to do something nationally to get an amendment. And his response always was, well, that's a state issue. The states need to do this. Well, yes, but that's not what they wanted. They wanted an amendment. So Alice, and I believe it was 300 women, went in to meet with the president and said, look, President Wilson, people are dying. You need to do something about this. And he once again looked at them and said, look, there's really nothing I can do. This is really a state issue. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Next slide, please. Alice said, well, there's something we can do. And on January 10th, 1917, Alice and her followers began picketing the White House. These women picketed the White House every single day, Monday through Saturday, from 10 in the morning until 6 at night. They became known as the Silent Sentinels. They carried banners that had sayings like the ones that you see here. They were unobtrusive. They stood up against the fence. They were quiet. But they were relentless. These women were there in every kind of weather that you can imagine. And back in those days, ladies, there was no LL Bean, fuzzy coats and warm boots that they could wear. Their headquarters at the time was across Lafayette Square. And so what the women would do is they would heat bricks, and they would run over so that the women could stand on the bricks to warm their feet so that their feet didn't freeze. But these women did not give up. They were there in rain, sleet, snow, hail. And Washington is, you live in Williamsburg, it gets miserable, hot and humid in the summer. I mean, they were there in all kinds of weather, but they were there every single day. Well, what happened was when Woodrow Wilson was reelected as president, and part of his campaign was that he was going to keep America out of World War I. Well, as soon as he became president, what do you suppose happened? He started talking about why we really needed to get involved in World War I, that we needed to go and fight the Kaiser so that the German people could remain in a democratic country. So Carrie Chapman Catt and her organization stood down. During that period of time, they were not out state by state advocating to get the vote. Alice Paul took a very different approach, and she said, now is the time we need to keep being in the public eye. And you know, what they were saying is, why should we send our young boys and men to Germany to fight for democracy when here in America, women do not have democracy. They do not have the vote. So they did not stand down. Wilson became less amused by what they were doing. And on June 22nd, 1917, he started having the women arrested on the made-up charge of obstructing traffic on the sidewalk, which of course there is no such thing. But these women were arrested, they were hauled off to court, and they were given the opportunity to pay a fine and to be let go. But most of them didn't, and so they began to put women in jail. There were two facilities at the time. There was one in DC proper, and there was one in Lorton, Virginia, and it was at the Occoquan Workhouse. And a large number of women were put on a train, and they were brought this 20 miles outside of Washington to Lorton, to this Occoquan Workhouse. Next slide, please. So I'm going to introduce you to Lucy Burns. Lucy was the co-founder of the National Women's Party with Alice Paul. In fact, they met in England and were disciples of the Pankhurst sisters at the time, and they co-founded the National Women's Party. And so part of their strategy was that Alice did not picket. Lucy picketed, and she got arrested and rearrested. She spent over 7 months in jail for quietly picketing. They didn't want Alice to picket because they felt that they needed to have one of the leaders that was not in jail. Well, at some point, Alice did picket, but they didn't keep them in the same facility. They did not want to have both of the leaders at the same place. So Lucy was at the Occoquan Workhouse, and Alice was incarcerated at the DC jail. They tried to get Alice committed to an insane asylum to get her out of the picture. They had her evaluated by a psychiatrist who basically said there was absolutely nothing wrong with her. She may have had a Joan of Arc complex, but that wasn't being insane. She knew exactly what she was doing, and that they did not find that to be the case. As I mentioned to you earlier, next slide, please, what would happen to these women in both facilities is they would go on hunger strikes. In the Occoquan Workhouse, the conditions were absolutely horrific. At the Occoquan Workhouse, and these women always asked to be treated as political prisoners, but they weren't. They were treated as common criminals, even though they hadn't even broken the law. You know, they had their personal clothing removed. They had to wear prison garb. They were kept in rat-infested facility. They were given urine-soaked mattresses, vomit-encrusted blankets. I mean, these were the conditions that these women were kept in for, you know, the great sin of quietly picketing the White House, you know, under the First Amendment right, for trying to exercise their rights. And so there were women who did go on hunger strikes in both facilities, and this is what force feeding looks like. These tubes were shoved down their noses, and there were milk and eggs that were poured in. And what you should know is that this force feeding isn't about nutrition, it's a type of torture. And so many of these women were tortured with these force feedings that took place in both facilities. So on the night of November 17th, 1917, a train load of 33 women were coming in from DC to the Occoquan Workhouse. Well, the superintendent, his name was Whitaker, knew that they were coming, And he went down to the Marine base and brought up a bunch of Marines, Quantico, and had them out of uniform. And when the women got there, he had them dragged across the street by these Marines, and they were thrown into punishment cells. One of the women hit her head and she was rendered unconscious. Her cellmate thought she was dead. She suffered a heart attack. They could get no medical treatment. They weren't given anything to eat or drink for over 36 hours. And it was as horrific as you can possibly imagine a situation to be. And these women these 33 women their age ranges were from the early 20s into the 70s. So there was a wide range of women, and probably all of us that are listening would have fit into there. So imagine us being treated like this. But what happened was word began to leak out about what this horrific treatment was. And so the president realized that he was going to be in big trouble if people recognized that he was the one that had them put into this situation. That night of November 17th, 1917 became known as the Night of Terror. You can Google Night of Terror and you can read all about it. It's pretty horrific. The women were taken from the workhouse. They were taken to the DC prison, and by the end of November, within a couple of weeks, they were all released. And so let's look at the next slide and kind of look at what happened here. These were the women being released from the Occoquan Workhouse. They could barely walk. They were taken to the courthouse. Some of them had to lay down on the benches because they were so weak they couldn't even sit up. Next slide, please. So we have the Night of Terror on November 14th, and these women had lawyers, and in January 7th, the U.S. Federal Court of Appeals heard a case that they had going through the courts about their incarceration being illegal. And President Wilson knew that the Court of Appeals was being heard. Washington was really a very small place back then, and so everybody knew everything that was going on. And so 3 days after that Federal Court of Appeals case, President Wilson was like, maybe I should rethink my position on women getting the vote. So he went to Congress, and he never mentioned the suffragists. What he said was, and this was true, that there were many women who went overseas during World War I in a medical capacity to help our soldiers. And so he talked about women getting suffrage because here these women had, done this wonderful job, and they had, gone to take care of our soldiers, and that he really thought that it was probably time for America to think about having a women vote. And it was a good thing he did, because on March 4th, the court declared that all of their sentences, all of their jailings had been illegal. Next slide, please. So the House passed the 19th Amendment in May. The Senate passed it in June 4th of 1919. So that effectively was the end of getting the amendment passed by Congress. And we needed 36 states at that time to ratify. And by the end of midsummer of 1920, we had 35 states. And so it came down to the last state in the queue was Tennessee. Tennessee ratified on August 18th, and then on August 26th, the Secretary of State of the United States certified the ratification, and that is when it became law, was on August 26th, 1920. Next slide, please. But I need to tell you a little story about what happened in Tennessee, because this is really, I think this is really quite amazing, and it's important. Anybody who was anybody that cared about suffrage descended on Nashville. So Carrie Chapman, Catt, and her group was there. Alice Paul was, because she didn't get that $2 million, bequeathment. She stayed in Washington. She was still raising money, but she had her women down there. There were also, you need to know that there were many women who were anti-suffragists. They were called the antis. They didn't think women needed the vote. And so they were there because, they didn't need to vote. Their husbands could vote for them, or their dads could vote for them, or whomever, but they didn't need the vote. They wanted to be, they wanted to be the mistresses of their home, and that's all they really cared about. And there were over 150 lobbyists who showed up in Tennessee. Well, why was that? Prohibition had already been passed, but the liquor people were afraid that if women got the vote, man, they would never get prohibition removed. So they were there, fighting women getting the vote. And there were also many, many businesses that were involved in manufacturing. Well, why was that? That was because they felt that if women got the vote, they were going to do everything they could to introduce child labor laws. So kids that were 9 and 10 working in these factories weren't going to be able to do that anymore. So it was raucous. They were having these smoke-filled bootleg, meetings in the back rooms and so forth and so on. But eventually the day of reckoning came. They had to go into chambers, and they all went in. And if you were against the amendment, you were wearing a red rose. And if you were for the amendment, you were wearing a yellow rose. That was the color of the suffrage. That was the flower of the suffrage movement. So they started taking roll call, and they got to Harry Byrne, 26-year-old legislator, 24-year-old legislator. And he had come in with a red rose. And he kind of took that red rose off. And when he was asked, he said, "I." And they got to the end. Well, before that, I need to tell you that Alice Paul had her women in the gallery. They counted the roses. They called Alice and said, "Alice, we don't have the vote. This is not going to pass." But when they got to the end and they added it all up, because Harry Byrne had changed his vote, it passed by 1 vote. And why do you suppose that was? He had received a letter from his mother the day before, 6-page letter from his mother the day before, that said, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against, they were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." And so the moral of the story, ladies, is twofold. Number one, don't ever think that your single vote is not important. A single vote is how we women got the right to vote in 1920. And by the way, I asked one of our historians, I said, "Edie," I said, "if this hadn't passed in 1920, when do you think we would have gotten the vote?" She said, "Not until probably World War II." Can you imagine? Until World War II. And of course, the second moral of the story is always listen to your mother. So it was quite an interesting story. So let me tell you a little bit about Turning Point. Next slide, please, and what our mission is. It's to educate, inspire, and empower present and future generations to remain vigilant in the quest for equal rights. The next slide will show you a rendering of what the memorial will look like when it's completed. And I'm very happy to tell you that we are under construction, and within about 10 days, we will have the first, can you go to the next slide, please? We will have the first stage of the memorial completed. We did not get some government funding that we had anticipated because of the pandemic, but it looks like we may be getting some traction on and getting some additional funding. The next slide, please, gives you a closer look at where we are. It's every element in the memorial has an intrinsic meaning dealing with the suffrage movement. You can see some people in a low wall. It's not going to actually look like that when it's finished, but that is a suffragist commemorative wall. And all of the women who were jailed are going to have their name on that wall. And you can also see people in the background, and you can kind of see those things kind of sticking up. There's going to be 19 stations that will tell the complete story of the suffrage movement, the 72 years from Seneca Falls, 1848 until 1920. So we're going to tell the whole story there. The next slide gives you an idea of who we are going to have in the memorial statues. We have Mary Church Terrell, an African-American woman who was very involved in the movement. Carrie Chapman Catt, as I mentioned to you, was the one that was head of NASA, and Alice Paul. They're still working on those statues. They're coming from Utah, and they're finishing those up. They should be installed in October. The next slide, you're going to see our groundbreaking that took place on November 14th. And the last thing that I want to tell you about is that the Turning Point Institute is something that is kind of phase 2 for us. Memorial is number 1. But we're going to establish a Turning Point Institute for middle and high school girls. And we want to be able to provide them with information about the importance of the Constitution, the importance of advocacy work, that in their lifetimes, there'll be something that they're going to be passionate about, and that if you don't get involved, things don't happen. And we want to use that. We want to use what the suffragists were able to accomplish to show them that tenacity and never giving up. There's a lot to be said for that. The next slide we're going to take a look at is something that one of your folks down there had asked us to put up. And this is about women that have run for office. It gives us some really great statistics on women who have been elected to positions in the United States that you can take a look at. And so I want you to know that Montana allowed women to vote in 1914, because you will recall that I said there were states that allowed women to vote in advance. And in 1917, they voted for Jeanette Rankin to become a member of the House of Representatives. So she was actually in Congress in 1917, and she was a member of Congress. So she was the first elected national woman for us. And one of the things that she campaigned on in Montana was she was against, there were a lot of people that were against getting into World War I. And in fact, when that came up for a vote in Congress, she was the only person that did not vote for America getting involved in World War I. But as you can see, things have improved as far as our elected positions for women, but we have a long way to go. I mean, from a personal standpoint, I really think we need more women, because we women bring a different perspective to topics. It doesn't mean that the end result of something might be different from what just men would do, but we bring a different perspective to the table and a different view on how to discuss these things. So I think that it's really good, and really happy to see this. And right now we are going to show you a video that was made and released on August 26th for Turning Point, and I hope you enjoy this.
On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to our Constitution was ratified by the states. This achievement was the result of the courage and determination by generations of women and men. We truly walk in the footsteps of giants.
The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is going to be the first national memorial to pay tribute to the women who fought for 72 years to win the vote. That created the largest expansion of democracy the country had ever seen. Yet a lot of people don't even know who these women were. We like to call this the best kept secret in American history.
It's important for people to remember this moment, indeed to celebrate it, when women achieved the right to vote. But all of us must remember the shoulders that we stand on. We simply would not have been here without the work that they did, the vision that they had, the success that they achieved.
The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is important to Virginia because it is a tangible reminder that our voices and our votes matter. It is an opportunity to acknowledge those whose voices have not been heard, whose tremendous contributions to our great nation haven't been acknowledged. We have recognized the great significance of the suffrage centennial throughout this year. We proudly lit the Executive Mansion in purple, white, and gold to celebrate.
Having something like the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial will bring attention to this really significant history and hopefully help us Americans better appreciate these stories and these incredible women.
This is a story that really needs to be told. The story of the suffragists, the stories of the picketers that were arrested for picketing the White House and being sent to the Lorton prison, that all happened right here.
It isn't something that's been in the history books. There are few memorials. Less than 10% of the memorials in this country are to women. We are not represented.
We want you to feel like you were there, like it was 1917 or the 1920 era. So a lot of the memorials designed with that in mind. So you have the bronze statues. Each of the information stations is designed to look like it's a newspaper article from the time. I really wanted you to feel like you were in the moment, that you could have been living in the 1917 era and feel what they felt. We will actually have a 24-foot section of the actual White House fence that the women picketed in front of in 1917.
Turning Point and Nova Parks are the very first entities to get a section of the actual White House fence. And the piece of White House fence that we are getting was actually there when the suffragists were standing in front of it with signs very pointedly asking President Wilson to give women the right to vote.
People can pose in front of the fence, they can look at it, they can understand this is living history, this is real.
Fairfax County is very rich with history throughout the county. We have so many landmarks and things for people to visit. Getting national attention for what we're doing, that strategically where this memorial is very helpful to encouraging people to come to our area and spend some time here.
We are working with Visit Fairfax, which is funded by Fairfax County Tourism. We are working with the Virginia Tourism Corporation throughout the state.
Virginia's history is much richer, much more diverse, and much more complicated than what many of us were taught in school. And this memorial will be an important resource for teaching history that accurately reflects the stories and experiences of everyone.
The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is only the beginning. Once the memorial is built, we have plans to create a Turning Point Institute where we bring in women, young girls, and kind of train them in some of the traits of the suffragists and how to become leaders themselves.
My name is Alice Paul Tapper, and I'm 12 years old. Without my mom naming me Alice Paul, I probably wouldn't have learned about her story. I really saw what the suffrage movement was like for those women, and it inspired me to be brave in my class. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about my experiences and raising my hand in class. And someone from Penguin Books saw my op-ed and asked me if I wanted to write a book.
I have a young daughter who's going into middle school next year, and she needs to understand that, there were a lot of sacrifices made by a lot of people to achieve equality in a lot of areas, and we certainly understand in times like this that there's still more work to be done.
And people are still trying to fight to have a voice in their government, and this just shows you that this is a continuing battle that we must still fight.
Because of a pandemic in our country, we've lost some funding that's not going to allow us to finish it this year. But we're going to finish it. We absolutely intend to move forward. We are under construction. We have a big portion of the memorial finished.
It's a hopeful project. It's a project about the future and hope and education to me, because that's the way that people succeed.
This memorial will stand in perpetuity to honor the bravery, the courage, and the commitment that these women had. It's going to be a beacon to young people growing up understanding that this is the sacrifice that was made for them.
We really need help to finish this suffragist memorial. We hope these stories have really inspired you. We hope to educate future generations about leadership If this interests you and you want to support us, please go to our website.
So, I don't know if anybody has questions. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but
Hey, Catt, we cannot hear you if you're speaking.
I am speaking. Okay. I'm not on mute.
I can hear her out here.
Can hear you.
I can hear her.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay. Well, anyway, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the suffrage movement and some wonderful women that were involved. There were about 5 million women across the country over 3 generations from 1848 to 1920 who were involved in the movement. Sometimes I also refer to it as the second revolution in the United States, and it was all about suffrage for women. And the last thing I would like to leave you with is that the 19th Amendment, as we know and we talked about, was passed in 1920, but minority women didn't get the vote in 1920. Native Americans, it wasn't until as late as 1962 for them to be able to vote. Asian Americans, 1952. African Americans, not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Latino women until 1975. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and so there's still a lot of discrimination. So I don't know if I'm still on or I'm not still on, but that's what I have to say.
Hey, Courtney, do you want me to take it from here? Are you still on?
I have lost sound, so yes, if you could wrap it up, I would greatly appreciate it.
Hey, Pat, this is Terry Benez. I lead the Business Council. So first of all, I think we are in technical difficulty. Yes. So I'm going to jump in here and save Courtney. But thank you so much. I have learned so much, and I'm still amazed by some of the facts. It still really just hurts my heart. So I want to say a humble and a huge thank you to you. But I do want to give a shout out to everybody on the phone too. This was done by the Business Council, and we have a lot of committee members on the board. I don't, on the call, I don't want to miss anybody. We have the Honorable Laura Overy, we have Kristen Baum, we have Barb Ramsey, we have Kathy Howe, we have Brittany Rice, and if I missed anybody, I'm sorry. But the Business Council has started the fund to donate $500 to put a plaque on this wall to help create it and support it. So if we get $1,000 donation, then we can put a plaque on the wall. And I know several of you have already donated, so we're getting closer. So we will make sure, Pat, that we support you and get that plaque up in honor of the Women's Business Council in Williamsburg.
Well, thank you very much. We are, because of where we are in construction, we would need to have that by the end of October.
Okay.
Because we're going to be actually fabricating the donor wall information. And if people are donating and intending it to be part of the Women's Council, I need to know that so that I can put it all together aggregately to come up with 1,000. So I need to have that information.
Okay, and if I remember right, there is a donate button on our invitation. We'll go up and make sure that everybody on this call has that information.
Yeah, the website has, you can go on, if you want to do online, you can go to our website, suffragistmemorial.org, and you can donate on our website.
So again, thank you, Pat. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us today. And we can't wait to come see the memorial live and in person. And if you come to Williamsburg, we hope you'll stop by and see us.
Thank you. I love Williamsburg. Thank you.
Come see us.
All right.
Okay,
I
thank you,
appreciate the
everybody.
opportunity. Thank you.
Thought we understood, but not anywhere near what you just shared. So all these years of studying. So, thank you.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you.